He was a polarizing figure in American politics who had his hand in some of the most significant events of the 1970s. Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State under Republican U.S. Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. He died at his home in Connecticut yesterday at the age of 100. He leaves behind a complicated legacy, with some praising him for his brilliance and experience, and others brandishing him a war criminal for his support of anti-communist dictatorships.
I do not believe that it is possible to conduct the foreign policy of the United States under these circumstances, when the character and credibility of the Secretary of State is at issue.
Henry Kissinger was a complicated figure, one of the most influential foreign policy figures in U.S. history, lauded for his expertise and experience, but at the same time called a war criminal by some for his support of anti-communist strongmen, especially in Latin America, and other controversial decisions.
Henry Kissinger was the most hawkish of Richard Nixon's advisors.
He was one of the most powerful figures in the administration of U.S. President Richard Nixon, serving as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. He was the primary architect of American foreign policy during that time, leading efforts to successfully open up diplomatic relations with China, to establish new and historic arms control talks with the Soviet Union, to expand ties between Israel and Arab states, and to complete the Paris Peace Accords with North Vietnam. But with those successes, there were also mistakes.
Many of the mistakes he made were a product of exaggeration of the threat posed by other nations. Out of his concern that the United States should not look weak, he advocated policies that would produce more harm than good.
Kissinger was criticized by some for his decision to increase U.S. military action during the Vietnam War.
I would then recommend that you start farming the retreaters out of them within 48 hours.
I have never dealt with a group of people as treacherous as the North Vietnamese leadership.
Nixon brought Kissinger into his administration after pledging to end the Vietnam War during his 1968 bid for the White House. But the process of so-called Vietnamization, shifting the burden of the war from the 500,000 U.S. troops to South Vietnamese forces, was lengthy and deadly. It included massive U.S. bombing campaigns in North Vietnam and a secret and controversial bombing campaign in Cambodia.
The Christmas bombings of North Vietnam, which were not needed. Actually, Kissinger had already negotiated a peace agreement with Hanoi, but because Saigon, that's the South, was against it, Kissinger advocated killing North Vietnamese in order to send a signal to Saigon that America was still standing with Saigon. Those people who died in North Vietnam didn't need to die.
Kissinger was jointly awarded the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize along with North Vietnam's Lee Duc Tho for ending the Vietnam War. But it was a controversial award, with two members of the Nobel Committee resigning in protest. Kissinger survived Nixon's Watergate scandal and became Secretary of State to President Gerald Ford, although Ford removed him as National Security Advisor, diminishing his iron grip on American foreign policy. After his time in government, he founded a powerful consulting firm and continued to engage in global political discourse, advising U.S. presidents and speaking out on foreign policy issues.
I want to tell you all how much it has meant to me, and that I'll never forget you.
For more, we're joined by Thomas Whalen. He's a U.S. presidential historian and author from Boston University. Thomas, there were people who loved him and hated him. How do you think Kissinger should be remembered?
Well, I think he'll be best remembered as a steward of American foreign policy in a period that America was in decline on the international stage following the Vietnam War. And, he was able to keep America relevant among, international players at the time, but really up to the present day in the 21st century. Because, with Vietnam, with Watergate and the various scandals of the late 60s and 70s, America's power was being questioned everywhere. The world had changed. And in many ways, the United States was the only kind of sole power left over from World War II for the longest time that was not bombed, or good parts of it were destroyed during that, great conflict of World War II. But by the 1970s, you had Japan, you had China, you had a number of international powers rising up from the ashes of that Second World War, now in a position to compete with the United States. And also you can include Germany in that as well. So Henry Kissinger was kind of the master juggler, kind of playing one side off the other, creating and crafting new alliances, such as famously with China against the Soviet Union. And in that way, it helped the United States recover a lot of the power and influence that it had lost during the Vietnam period.
How significant were his efforts to open up China to U.S. relations in the 1970s?
Well, it's, basically that's going to be, I think right now the first line of his history book. He had orchestrated the great opening, but again, you have to have a caveat to that because it was Richard Nixon's strategy. And in many ways, you can't separate Richard Nixon from Henry Kissinger. They worked as a team. And, unlike a lot of cases in history throughout the world, these two huge influences were on the same page. Even though personally they hated each other, they would always snipe behind each other's backs, but they had the same strategic goals in mind. And, they, in many ways, created, what we would consider the modern American foreign policy establishment in the 21st century.
He also played a key diplomatic role in the Arab-Israeli conflict at that time. What was the lasting impact of those efforts?
Well, at least he got both sides to the table. And, he was able to get both sides to make concessions, which today seems to be unheard of in American foreign policy circles. It seems this untractable problem that will never, ever be solved. But Henry Kissinger was of that persuasion that there's no such things as unsolvable problems. Now, you can obviously, though, argue his means, and, that will be forever debated in the centuries to come.
What about his impact after leaving government? He has remained a force up until even this summer, meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Power, as he once said, is the greatest aphrodisiac, right? He can never leave himself a great distance away from power centers, not just here in the United States, but Europe, Africa, Asia. I mean, he, relished being a player on the international scene. And, up to the day he died, he was very much involved, writing essays, books. I mean, his last book was on what he considered the menace and threat of AI to human civilization. I mean, the guy was around 100 years old. I mean, I can't think of anyone being that kind of engaged or productive at that late stage.
That's Thomas Whalen from Boston University. Thomas, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.